In the sterile halls of the Galactic Military Academy, where the brightest minds from 100 worlds train to become tomorrow's defenders, one question has always been forbidden: why are humans banned from serving? The official records are sealed. The instructors change the subject. Even the ancient AI databases refuse to answer. But, when Cadet Zara-Th of the Crystalline Veltar discovers a hidden archive deep within the Academy's forbidden sectors, she and her fellow cadets are about to learn that humanity's exile wasn't punishment for weakness, it was the galaxy's desperate attempt to contain something far more terrifying than any weapon ever created. Something that made even the proudest warrior races beg for mercy. Something that turned the tide of the Great War in ways that still give nightmares to those who remember. Something that lives within every human heart, waiting to be unleashed. Prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about courage, warfare, and the true meaning of human nature. This is the story the Galactic Council never wanted told, the real reason why humanity stands alone among the stars, and why some doors should never be opened. Are you ready to discover what made the galaxy fear the species that calls itself human? The alarm bells of the Galactic Military Academy rang through the crystalline corridors at exactly 0600 Standard Time, just as they had every morning for the past 300 years. Cadet Zara-Th pressed her six-fingered hand against the cool metal of her dormitory wall and felt the vibrations travel through her translucent blue skin. Her people, the Veltar, experienced sound as much through touch as through their auditory organs, and the morning bells always reminded her of home. She rolled out of her sleeping pod, her movements fluid and graceful despite her towering 8-foot frame. Around her, other cadets from dozens of different species began their morning routines. The reptilian SSK hissed their traditional dawn greeting while the furry Makhtari chatted in their rapid, high-pitched language. The dormitory was a symphony of alien sounds, smells, and movements that had become as familiar to Zara-Th as her own heartbeat. "Another day in paradise," muttered Kexan, her Thorian roommate, as his forearms stretched in different directions. His rocky, granite-like skin caught the artificial morning light filtering through the windows. The Thorians were known throughout the galaxy for their pessimism, but Kexan took it to new levels. Zara-Th smiled, her facial crystals shifting color from deep blue to warm purple, indicating amusement. "At least we have advanced tactical theory today. I heard Instructor Velnox is going to cover the Battle of the Crimson Nebula." "Oh wonderful," Kexan grumbled, "another glorious tale of how the great Velnox personally led the charge against the Shadow Fleet. I'm sure it will be completely accurate and not at all embellished." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the dormitory entrance. A group of cadets had gathered around someone, their voices raised in animated discussion. Zara-Th's curiosity, a trait that often got her into trouble, pulled her toward the crowd. At the center of the group stood Thys an ex-Mari whose serpentine lower body coiled nervously as she spoke. Her scaled hands gestured wildly as she explained something to the gathered cadets. The next Mari were known for their photographic memories and attention to detail, so when Thys got excited about something, it was usually worth listening to. "I'm telling you, I saw it with my own eyes," Thys was saying, her forked tongue flicking out nervously. "There's a section in the lower archives that isn't on any of the official maps. The access panel was hidden behind a maintenance shaft in section C7. A Rak-T cadet, his insectoid features skeptical, clicked his mandibles dismissively. "You probably just found an old storage room. The Academy is full of them." "No, you don't understand," Thys insisted, her voice dropping to a whisper that made everyone lean in closer. "There were files down there. Old files. And some of them mentioned humans." The word hung in the air like a forbidden curse. Several cadets immediately stepped back, their various facial expressions shifting to show discomfort, fear, or confusion. The topic of humans was strictly off limits at the Academy, and everyone knew it. Zara-Th felt her crystals shift to a deep red color, indicating intense interest. Throughout her 3 years at the Academy, she had wondered about the mysterious species that was supposedly banned from galactic warfare. The official curriculum mentioned them briefly in historical contexts, but always as a footnote, never in detail. Any attempt to ask questions about humans was quickly redirected by instructors who claimed the information was classified. "You're talking nonsense," said Gorthak, a massive Brultai whose tusked face showed clear disapproval. His people served as the galaxy's primary military force, and they had little patience for what they considered idle gossip. "Humans are banned for good reason. The Council made that decision centuries ago, and we don't question the Council's wisdom. But, why? Asked Pip-11, a small, furry Yelnari whose large eyes showed curiosity. We study every other species' military tactics and history. Why are humans different? Gorthake's trunk-like nose flared, a sign of irritation among his people. Because some things are better left buried, little one. Some knowledge is too dangerous. Zarath exchanged glances with Kexhan, whose stone features had managed to convey skepticism despite their limited mobility. They had often discussed the mystery of humanity during their late-night study sessions, theorizing about what could possibly make an entire species so dangerous that they were forbidden from participating in galactic warfare. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Senior Instructor Talvek, a Zephyrian whose gaseous form shimmered in the artificial light. His presence immediately scattered the group of cadets, who quickly returned to their morning routines. Talvek's voice resonated through specialized speakers attached to his containment suit. Cadets, you should be preparing for morning formation, not engaging in idle speculation. I trust you all remember the importance of focusing on approved curriculum materials. The group dispersed quickly, but Zarath noticed the meaningful look Thyssera gave her before slithering away. There was something the Nexmari wanted to share, something she couldn't say in front of an instructor. The morning proceeded as usual. Formation was held in the Grand Assembly Chamber, where nearly 10,000 cadets from over 100 different species stood in perfect rows while Academy Commandant Zurith delivered the daily briefing. The Commandant was an ancient Eternal, one of the energy beings who had helped found the Galactic Council millennia ago. His crystalline form pulsed with various colors as he spoke about duty, honor, and service to the greater galaxy. Zarath tried to pay attention, but her mind kept drifting back to Thyssera's discovery. What kind of files about humans could be hidden in the lower archives? And why were they hidden at all? If humans were simply another species that had been banned from military service for some minor infraction, why the secrecy? After formation came the usual rounds of classes. Military history, advanced tactics, xenobiology, weapons systems, and strategic planning filled the day with lectures, simulations, and practical exercises. Zarath excelled in most subjects, particularly those requiring analytical thinking and problem-solving. Her crystalline physiology allowed her to process multiple streams of information simultaneously, making her one of the top students in her class. During lunch, she finally managed to corner Thyssera in a quiet section of the cafeteria. The Nexmari was picking at a bowl of the live fish that made up most of her diet, her scaled hands trembling slightly as she ate. Tell me about what you found, Zarath said without preamble, settling her large frame onto the specially designed chair that could accommodate her people's unique physiology. Thyssera looked around nervously before leaning closer. I was doing research for my galactic history project, you know, the one about pre-council warfare? I needed to access some old battle records, and I got permission to use the general archives. But I took a wrong turn in the lower levels and found this maintenance tunnel that led to a section that shouldn't exist. She paused to swallow a fish whole, her throat bulging as it went down. The access panel was hidden behind some old pipes, and it wasn't locked. I think someone forgot it existed. Inside, there were dozens of data cores, really old ones, from before the modern filing system was installed. And they mentioned humans? More than mentioned them, Thyssera whispered. There were entire battle reports, casualty lists, tactical analyses. Zarath, humans weren't just banned from military service. They were involved in something called the Pacification War. Have you ever heard of that? Zarath's crystals shifted to deep purple, indicating confusion and concern. She had studied galactic military history extensively, and she had never encountered any reference to a pacification war. No. When did it happen? According to the dates on the files, about 350 years ago. Just before the modern Galactic Council was established. Thyssera's voice dropped even lower. But, here's the strange part. All the official histories say the Council was formed as a natural evolution of the various species' diplomatic relations. But, these files suggest there was a major conflict right before the Council's formation, and humans were right in the middle of it. Kexhan approached their table, his heavy footsteps announcing his presence well before he arrived. Are you two plotting something illegal again? He asked, settling his massive frame onto a reinforced chair. Because if you are, I want to be included. Life here is boring enough as it is. Zarath quickly filled him in on what Thyssera had discovered. The Thorians' granite features somehow managed to convey intense interest despite their limited expressiveness. Hidden archives, mysterious wars, banned species, Kexhan mused. This sounds like the beginning of a very bad idea that I'm probably going to regret participating in. You're interested though, Zarath observed. Oh, absolutely. My people may be pessimistic, but we're also incredibly curious about things that could potentially kill us. It's one of our more endearing traits. THYSSera looked between them nervously. I'm not sure we should pursue this. What if we get caught? What if there's a good reason those files are hidden? There's always a good reason to hide information, Kexhan said. The question is whether it's good for us or good for the people doing the hiding. Zarath felt her crystals cycling through various colors as she processed the conflicting emotions and thoughts swirling through her mind. Curiosity warred with caution, excitement with fear. But, ultimately, her nature won out. Show us, she said simply. That evening, after lights out, the three cadets made their way through the academy's dimly lit corridors. Zarath's natural bioluminescence had been dimmed to its lowest setting, providing just enough light to navigate by. THYSSera led the way, her serpentine movement perfectly silent against the metal floors. Kexhan brought up the rear, his normally thunderous footsteps somehow reduced to barely audible whispers. The academy at night was a different place entirely. The usual sounds of thousands of cadets going about their daily routines were replaced by the low hum of life support systems and the distant whisper of air recyclers. Security patrols were minimal in the living quarters, since the Academy's advanced monitoring systems were considered sufficient to prevent any serious mischief. They made their way down several levels, following maintenance corridors that THYSSera had memorized during her earlier exploration. The architecture changed as they descended, becoming more utilitarian and less concerned with aesthetic appeal. These were the working levels of the Academy, where the machinery that kept everything running was housed and maintained. Here, THYSSera whispered, stopping in front of what appeared to be a solid wall covered in pipes and conduits. She pressed her scaled hand against a particular section, and a hidden panel slid aside, revealing a narrow passage beyond. How did you even find this? Kexhan asked, examining the concealed entrance with professional interest. Accident. I was following what I thought was a power conduit for my engineering project, and I noticed it didn't match the schematics. When I investigated, I found this. They crawled through the narrow passage single file, emerging into a small chamber that had clearly been forgotten by whoever designed the Academy's modern layout. The room was filled with old-style data storage units, their crystalline matrices still glowing with stored information despite their obvious age. Zarath approached one of the units and placed her hand on its activation pad. Her crystalline physiology allowed her to interface directly with most computer systems, a useful trait for someone in her chosen field. Information flowed into her consciousness as she accessed the stored data. What she found made her crystals flare bright red with shock and disbelief. The files contained detailed records of military engagements between human forces and various galactic powers. But these weren't ordinary battle reports. The humans weren't fighting alongside other species as allies or mercenaries. They were fighting against the entire galaxy, and, according to these records, they were winning. Battle after battle showed human forces defeating seemingly impossible odds. A single human ship destroying an entire Brultai battle fleet. Human ground forces overrunning fortified SSK war positions despite being outnumbered 100 to 1. Human pilots outmaneuvering the supposedly unbeatable Veltar crystal fighters. But it wasn't just their tactical victories that made these records so disturbing. It was the way they fought. The reports described human warriors who refused to surrender even when facing certain death. Soldiers who continued fighting with mortal wounds that would have incapacitated any other species. Ship crews who rammed their vessels into enemy formations rather than allow themselves to be captured. And, strangest of all, the reports consistently mentioned something called human rage or the human factor as a decisive element in their victories. The alien commanders writing these reports seemed both fascinated and terrified by this concept, describing it as a transformation that occurred in human warriors during combat, turning them into something beyond rational strategy or normal tactical considerations. What are you finding? THYSSera asked, noticing the rapid color changes in Zarath's crystals. Zarath transferred some of the data to portable storage units before responding. These humans, they weren't banned from galactic warfare because they were weak or unreliable. They were banned because they were too dangerous.
Dangerous how?
Kexan asked, leaning over her shoulder to examine the data streams flowing across the old display units. According to these records, they fought a war against the entire Galactic Coalition and were winning until... Zara-Th paused as she accessed another file. Until they voluntarily agreed to exile themselves from galactic society in exchange for the war ending. The three cadets stared at each other in stunned silence as the implications sank in. Everything they had been taught about galactic history, about the formation of the Council, about the peaceful development of interspecies cooperation, had apparently been built on a lie. "We need to see more of these files," Zara-Th said finally. "If this is true, if humans really were capable of fighting the entire galaxy to a standstill, then everything we think we know about warfare, about tactics, about what's possible in combat, is incomplete." THYSSR's scales rippled nervously. "But what if we're caught? What if there are consequences for knowing this information?" "Then, we'll face them," Zara-Th replied, her crystals settling into a determined deep blue. "Some knowledge is worth the risk." They spent the next several hours copying as much data as they could, using portable storage devices to preserve the information for later analysis. The records painted a picture of humanity that was completely at odds with everything they had learned about galactic history. As they prepared to leave, Kexan discovered something that made them all freeze in terror. Hidden in a corner of the chamber was a security monitoring device, its red indicator light showing that it had been recording their entire visit. "How long do you think before they come for us?" THYSSRA whispered, her voice barely audible. "Probably not long," Zara-Th replied, checking the chronometer on her datapad. "We should get back to our quarters and pretend nothing happened. Maybe they won't notice for a few days." But, even as they made their way back through the Academy's corridors, Zara-Th knew their lives had just changed forever. They had uncovered a secret that the galaxy's most powerful institutions wanted buried, and there would inevitably be consequences. What they couldn't know was that their discovery was about to set in motion a chain of events that would bring them face to face with the truth about humanity, and force them to confront questions about warfare, courage, and the nature of strength that no cadet should ever have to answer. In her quarters, as she lay in her sleeping pod staring at the ceiling, Zara-Th clutched the data storage device containing copies of the human files. Whatever happened next, whatever punishments awaited them for their unauthorized investigation, she was determined to learn the truth about the species that had apparently been deemed too dangerous for the galaxy to handle. The truth about humanity was out there, hidden in classified archives and forbidden records. And she was going to find it. The summons came at dawn, delivered by a security drone that projected Academy Commandant Zuritha's imposing holographic form directly into Zara-Th's dormitory. The ancient Eternal's crystalline body pulsed with deep red hues, indicating severe displeasure. His voice resonated with harmonics that made every cadet in the room stop what they were doing to listen. "Cadet Zara-Th of the Veltar, Cadet Kexan of Thorian Prime, and Cadet THYSSRA of the Nexmari Collective, you will report to Conference Room 7 in the administrative sector immediately. You have 10 minutes. The hologram dissolved, leaving behind an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on everyone present. Zara-Th felt her crystals cycling rapidly through different colors as anxiety and fear warred with determination in her mind. Around her, other cadets whispered nervously, speculating about what could have warranted such a formal summons. Kexan appeared in the doorway, his granite features managing to convey grim acceptance despite their limited expressiveness. "Well," he said in his characteristic deadpan manner, "it's been an honor serving with you both. I assume our brief criminal careers are about to come to an end." THYSSRA arrived moments later, her serpentine form coiled with nervous tension. Her scales had shifted to a pale green color that indicated fear among her people. "Do you think they know everything?" she whispered as they made their way through the Academy's corridors. "They know enough," Zara-Th replied, checking to ensure the hidden data storage device was still concealed in a fold of her uniform. She had made copies of the most important files, distributing them among secure locations in case their discovery led to confiscation of evidence. "The question is how much trouble we're in and whether they'll let us explain why we did it." The administrative sector was normally off limits to cadets except for official business. As they walked through its polished corridors, past offices filled with instructors and Academy staff, Zara-Th felt the weight of hundreds of eyes following their progress. News of their summons had apparently spread quickly through the Academy's communication networks. Conference Room 7 turned out to be a large chamber designed to accommodate representatives from multiple species. The ceiling was high enough for flying species, the floor had both solid surfaces and pools for aquatic beings, and the atmosphere was carefully regulated to support dozens of different respiratory requirements. At the center of the room sat a curved table where 5 figures waited for them. Academy Commandant Zurith dominated the space, his energy-based form shifting between various crystalline configurations as he processed information. To his right sat Senior Tactical Instructor Velnox, the Zephyrian whose war stories had entertained generations of cadets. The other 3 figures were unknown to the cadets, but their uniforms marked them as high-ranking officers from the Galactic Defense Force. "Cadets," Zurith began, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate, "you stand accused of unauthorized access to classified materials, breach of Academy security protocols, and possession of restricted information. These are serious charges that could result in immediate expulsion and criminal prosecution." Zara Th stepped forward, her crystals shifting to a respectful blue despite her inner turmoil. "Commandant, we accept responsibility for our actions, but we believe the information we discovered is too important to ignore. The Academy teaches us to seek truth and question assumptions."
That's exactly what we were doing.
One of the unknown officers, a Rakti with scarred mandibles that spoke of extensive combat experience, leaned forward aggressively.
Questioning assumptions is one thing, Cadet. Breaking into forbidden archives and stealing classified military records is quite another. Do you have any idea what kind of security breach you've created?
Kexhan's voice rumbled through the chamber with typical Thorian directness.
We wouldn't have had to break into anything if the information hadn't been hidden in the first place.
Every other species' military history is part of our standard curriculum.
Why are humans the exception?
The question seemed to spark something among the officers. Zara Th noticed meaningful glances exchanged between them, subtle shifts in posture that suggested her friend had struck closer to the truth than they were comfortable with.
Senior Instructor Velnox's gaseous form shimmered as he spoke. "Some information is classified for the protection of galactic stability, Cadet. Not every truth is suitable for academic study."
"But why this truth specifically?"
Thysera interjected, her nervousness making her voice higher than usual. "We found records of something called the Pacification War. Human forces fighting against the entire Galactic Coalition. If this really happened, why isn't it part of our military education? Shouldn't we study all significant conflicts to better understand warfare?" The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the environmental systems.
Zara Th watched as the officers seemed to engage in some kind of silent communication, their various forms of nonverbal expression indicating intense discussion about how to proceed. Finally, Commandant Zurith pulsed a deep amber color and spoke. "The 3 of you have placed us in a difficult position. The information you've discovered is indeed classified, but your unauthorized access means we must now decide whether to prosecute you for security violations or address your questions directly."
Another of the unknown officers, this one a tall, ethereal being whose species Zara Th didn't recognize, spoke for the first time.
Her voice carried overtones that suggested great age and authority.
"Perhaps it would be instructive to show them exactly why this information is restricted."
Sometimes the most effective lesson is direct experience.
Director Ashmiran, Velnox cautioned, "Are you suggesting we violate Council Directive 847? The prohibition against sharing detailed information about human capabilities is absolute."
"The prohibition exists to prevent panic and maintain social stability," the ancient being replied.
"But these cadets have already accessed some of the basic information.
Leaving them with incomplete knowledge might be more dangerous than providing proper context." Zara Th felt her crystals brightening with excitement despite the dangerous situation.
"You're going to tell us what really happened? The truth about humans and the Pacification War?"
"Not tell you," Director Ashmiran corrected.
"Show you.
But understand that once you see this information, you will be bound by the same classification restrictions that govern all council members. You will never be able to discuss what you learn here with anyone who doesn't already have access to these records." The 3 cadets exchanged glances before nodding their agreement. Whatever consequences awaited them, the opportunity to understand the truth about humanity was worth the risk.
Director Ashmiran gestured toward the chamber's main display system, and the lights dimmed as holographic projectors activated.
The air above the conference table shimmered and resolved into a 3-dimensional star map showing the galaxy as it existed 3.5 centuries ago. "The Pacification War," she began, "was not called by that name at the time. The various species involved referred to it by different terms. The Broltai called it the War of Impossible Odds.
The SSK War named it the Time of Breaking.
The Veltar records refer to it as the Crystal Nightmare. But historians eventually settled on Pacification War because that's what the humans themselves called their campaign. The star map zoomed in on a small section near what was now considered the galactic frontier. Several systems flashed red, indicating conflict zones. Humanity had been members of the galactic community for approximately 75 years when the war began. They were considered a minor species, militarily insignificant despite their rapid technological development. Their homeworld was located in what we now call the restricted zone, and their colonies numbered fewer than 20 systems. New holographic displays showed human settlements, space stations, and early starship designs. To Zarati's eye, they looked primitive compared to modern galactic technology, though she noticed some interesting design innovations that seemed surprisingly practical. The conflict began with what appeared to be a minor territorial dispute. Several galactic powers, led by the hegemony of advanced species, decided to relocate humanity to a smaller, less strategically valuable region of space. This was presented as a routine administrative decision, the kind of minor adjustment that occurred regularly as the galactic community evolved. Kexon leaned forward, his massive frame somehow conveying intense concentration.
Let me guess. The humans didn't agree to be relocated. Director Ashmiran's ethereal form shifted in what might have been amusement. That would be an understatement.
The human response to the relocation order was a single word transmitted simultaneously to every major galactic power: no. The star map changed, showing the movement of massive fleets converging on human space. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of thousands of ships from dozens of different species, all moving to enforce what should have been a simple administrative decision.
The hegemony assumed that a show of overwhelming force would convince humanity to comply peacefully.
After all, they were outnumbered nearly 1,000 to 1.
No rational species would choose to fight against such odds.
But humans aren't rational, Thysera whispered, her scales shifting to display fascination despite her fear.
That was the first lesson the galaxy learned about humanity, Director Ashmiran confirmed. Rationality, as understood by galactic civilization, was not the primary driving force behind human decision-making.
When faced with extinction or surrender, they chose a third option that no one had considered possible.
The holographic display shifted to show the first major engagement of the war.
A small human fleet, perhaps 50 ships, facing a hegemony armada of over 5,000 vessels.
The outcome should have been predetermined, a brief and decisive victory for galactic civilization.
Instead, the display showed the human fleet charging directly into the center of the enemy formation, ignoring standard tactical doctrine that called for defensive positioning and careful maneuvering.
What followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic military history.
Human warships were initially considered inferior in terms of raw firepower and defensive capabilities, Director Ashmiran explained as the battle simulation played out. But they had been designed with radically different priorities.
Instead of maximizing protection for their crews, humans had focused on damage output and maneuverability.
Zarati watched in amazement as the human ships seemed to dance between enemy formations, taking devastating damage but continuing to fight long past the point where any other species would have retreated or surrendered. Ship after ship disappeared in explosions of plasma and metal, but each one took multiple enemy vessels with it. This was our first introduction to what human military philosophers call acceptable losses, the director continued. Other species calculate engagement parameters based on minimizing casualties while achieving objectives.
Humans calculate them based on achieving objectives regardless of casualties.
They were willing to die, Kexon observed, his voice carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been respect.
All of them, if necessary.
Not just willing, Commandant Zurith interjected, his crystalline form pulsing with troubled colors. They considered death in combat to be preferable to surrender or retreat. This concept was so alien to galactic thinking that our military leaders initially dismissed it as propaganda or psychological warfare.
The holographic display shifted to show casualty reports from the early battles.
The numbers were shocking. Human forces routinely suffered casualties rates of 70, 80, even 90% while continuing to fight effectively. Enemy forces, despite numerical superiority, began suffering morale problems as they realized their opponents literally could not be intimidated or demoralized. The second phase of the war began when the hegemony decided that humanity's resistance was symptomatic of some kind of mental illness or social dysfunction, Director Ashmiran continued. They organized what they called therapeutic intervention fleets designed to capture human colonies intact and provide psychological treatment for what they assumed was species-wide insanity.
THYSSR's forked tongue flicked out nervously. I'm guessing that didn't work either.
The therapeutic intervention fleets encountered something that galactic civilization had never seen before and could barely comprehend, the director replied.
Human civilians who had been armed and trained for combat.
Not professional soldiers or warrior castes, but ordinary humans, farmers, teachers, artists, engineers, who had decided to fight rather than be captured. The holographic display showed orbital bombardments of human colonies, followed by ground invasions that should have been routine mop-up operations. Instead, the attacking forces found themselves fighting house-to-house battles against opponents who seemed to regard every civilian building as a fortress worth defending to the death. Children as young as 10 years old were found carrying weapons and participating in combat operations, Commandant Zurith added, his voice carrying harmonics of deep disturbance. Elderly humans who could barely walk were discovered manning improvised explosive devices designed to take as many enemies as possible when triggered.
Entire families chose to die together rather than surrender.
Zara-TH felt her crystals cycling through rapid color changes as she struggled to process what she was seeing. Her people, like most galactic species, had clear distinctions between military personnel and civilians. The idea of children and elderly individuals participating in warfare was almost incomprehensible. This is when the galaxy began to understand that humanity's military culture was not simply a matter of tactical doctrine or strategic thinking, Director Ashmiran explained.
It was a fundamental aspect of their species' psychology. They did not fight wars to achieve political objectives while minimizing losses. They fought wars to destroy their enemies completely, regardless of cost to themselves. But surely some humans must have been reasonable, THYSSRA protested. Some must have been willing to negotiate or compromise.
There were indeed humans who attempted to negotiate peace agreements, the director acknowledged. Several thousand of them were organized into what they called peace delegations and sent to various galactic capitals to discuss surrender terms.
And the delegations turned out to be elaborate suicide attacks.
The peace negotiators were carrying concealed weapons and explosives. They used their diplomatic status to get close to key military and political leaders, then detonated themselves in coordinated strikes that killed hundreds of high-ranking officials across dozens of worlds.
The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in.
Zara-TH tried to imagine a species so committed to warfare that they would use peace negotiations as weapons, and found the concept almost impossible to grasp. This was when the galactic powers realized they were not fighting a conventional war, Director Ashmiran continued. They were fighting a species that regarded warfare itself as a form of artistic expression, where death in combat was considered the highest possible honor. Every tactical innovation, every strategic adaptation the galaxy developed was immediately countered by humans who seemed to anticipate and prepare for responses that hadn't even been implemented yet. The holographic display showed the progression of the war over several years. What had begun as a simple administrative enforcement action had escalated into the largest military conflict in galactic history. Entire sectors were depopulated, whole species devoted their entire economic output to the war effort, and casualty figures reached numbers that were difficult to comprehend. The turning point came when humanity unveiled what they called their final protocol, Director Ashmiran said, her ancient voice carrying overtones of remembered terror. After 3 years of constant warfare, they had developed what can only be described as industrial-scale methods for producing warriors.
What do you mean?
Zara-TH asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. They began converting their entire civilization into a military machine focused on a single objective, inflicting maximum possible damage on their enemies before being destroyed.
Every human colony became a fortress. Every human ship became a weapon. Every human citizen became a soldier trained from childhood in the art of warfare.
The display showed human ships that looked more like flying fortresses than traditional vessels, bristling with weapons and armor while completely ignoring life support amenities or crew comfort. Ground installations that resembled mechanical nightmares designed solely for killing and destruction. By the final year of the war, humanity had achieved something that theoretically should have been impossible, the director concluded. Despite being outnumbered by ratios that reached as high as 10,000 to 1, they were winning.
How?
Kexon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because they had made the galaxy afraid. Director Ashmiran paused in her narrative, allowing the weight of her final words to settle in the chamber. The silence stretched for long moments as the three cadets processed the implications of what they had learned. Zara felt her crystals cycling through deep purples and blues as she struggled to comprehend a form of warfare so alien to everything she had been taught. "How do you make an entire galaxy afraid?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The ancient being's ethereal form shifted, taking on configurations that suggested deep memory and old pain. "By demonstrating that conventional military logic has no meaning when applied to your species. By proving that every assumption about warfare, about acceptable losses, about rational strategic thinking, becomes meaningless when facing an enemy that values victory above survival." The holographic display changed again, showing star charts marked with red zones that seemed to expand like an infection across multiple sectors. Each red area represented territory where galactic forces had simply stopped operating, not because they had been defeated in conventional terms, but because the cost of maintaining a presence had become unbearable. Senior Instructor Velnox's gaseous form rippled as he spoke. The psychological impact of fighting humans began to affect entire species. Military units that had faced human forces developed what psychologists called engagement syndrome, a form of combat trauma that persisted long after the battles had ended. "What kind of trauma?" Thysera asked, her scaled hands trembling slightly as she coiled and uncoiled her serpentine lower body. "Warriors who had fought against humans would return to their home worlds changed," Velnox explained. "They reported nightmares about enemies who laughed while dying, who sang songs during orbital bombardments, who treated the most horrific battlefield conditions as if they were celebrations. Many couldn't function in normal society anymore because they had seen things that challenged their fundamental understanding of how intelligent beings were supposed to behave." Commandant Zurith added his own observations, his crystalline form pulsing with troubled colors. Veteran soldiers from dozens of species began refusing orders to engage human forces. Not because they were cowards, these were beings who had faced the galaxy's most dangerous threats without hesitation, but because fighting humans was psychologically destructive in ways that no amount of training could prepare them for. Director Ashmiran gestured toward the display, which now showed detailed recordings from various battles. The images were disturbing even centuries later: human soldiers advancing through weapons fire that should have stopped any rational attack, human pilots ramming their fighters into enemy ships while broadcasting what could only be described as celebration songs, human ground forces charging into overwhelming odds while displaying what appeared to be genuine joy. The galaxy's military commanders found themselves facing an enemy that couldn't be understood using traditional strategic analysis, she continued. Human battle tactics made no sense from a survival perspective, but they were devastatingly effective from a purely destructive standpoint. They weren't trying to win battles in the conventional sense, they were trying to inflict maximum psychological damage on their enemies. Zara leaned forward, her analytical mind trying to understand the strategic logic behind such an approach. "But that's not sustainable. You can't maintain a military force if your primary tactic is accepting massive casualties." "That's what every galactic military theorist assumed," Director Ashmiran replied. "They kept waiting for humanity's losses to reach the point where they would be forced to negotiate or retreat. But it never happened, because humans had solved the sustainability problem in a way that no one anticipated." The holographic display shifted to show human population centers during the war years. What Zara saw made her crystals flare with shock and disbelief. "They weaponized their entire reproductive and educational system," Kexhan observed, his granite features somehow managing to convey horror despite their limited expressiveness. "They weren't just training soldiers, they were producing them." Human society during the war years became something unprecedented in galactic history, Director Ashmiran confirmed. A civilization where every aspect of life was organized around creating more efficient warriors. Children learned mathematics by calculating weapons trajectories. They learned chemistry by studying explosive compounds. They learned history by analyzing famous battles and strategic victories. The images showed human schools that looked more like military academies, where children as young as 5 years old practiced combat maneuvers as part of their regular education. Playgrounds designed to teach tactical thinking. Art classes focused on camouflage and concealment techniques. But the truly disturbing part wasn't the militarization of their education system, the director continued. It was the discovery that humans actually enjoyed this lifestyle. They weren't being forced to become a warrior culture by external pressure. They were embracing it voluntarily because it appealed to something fundamental in their psychological makeup. Thysera's voice was barely audible when she spoke. "They liked fighting." "More than liked it," Senior Instructor Velnox corrected. They appear to find warfare spiritually fulfilling in ways that galactic psychologists still don't fully understand.
Human prisoners of war, when interrogated, consistently expressed gratitude for the opportunity to test themselves in combat.
They described battle as the purest form of existence and claimed that peaceful civilians from other species were incomplete beings who had never truly lived.
The holographic display showed recordings from prisoner interrogation sessions.
Human captives, many severely wounded and facing certain execution, displayed attitudes that their captors found incomprehensible. They showed no signs of defeat or demoralization. Instead, they appeared genuinely curious about their captors' military capabilities and eager to discuss tactical innovations they had observed during recent battles.
One human prisoner, when asked about his species' war goals, gave an answer that became famous throughout galactic military circles, Director Ashmiran said. He told his interrogators that humans weren't fighting to achieve any specific political objective.
They were fighting because warfare was the natural state of any species worth respecting, and peace was just a temporary condition that allowed weak civilizations to pretend they were still alive. Zara-Th felt a chill run through her crystalline structure. The casual way the director delivered that quote, and the matter-of-fact tone in which it had apparently been given, suggested a level of commitment to warfare that went beyond mere military strategy. It was philosophy, religion, and identity all combined into something that transcended rational analysis. This is when the Galactic Council began to understand that they weren't fighting a war in any conventional sense, the director continued. They were in conflict with a species that regarded their entire existence as preparation for or participation in combat. Humanity hadn't developed a military culture, they had evolved as warriors whose civilization was simply the infrastructure that supported their primary function as fighters. The display showed the expansion of human territory during the later stages of the war. Despite suffering casualties that should have rendered them militarily ineffective, human forces continued advancing into galactic space, capturing systems and resources that they immediately converted into additional military infrastructure. The psychological warfare effects began spreading beyond military units to civilian populations, Commandant Zurith added. Entire worlds started demanding that their governments negotiate with humans or simply surrender rather than risk invasion. The mere possibility of facing human ground forces became enough to cause political upheavals across dozens of systems. Kexon spoke up, his voice carrying a note of grim admiration. They had figured out how to win without actually winning battles. By making themselves too terrifying to fight, they forced their enemies to defeat themselves. Exactly, Director Ashmiran confirmed. But that strategy also revealed something about humanity that made the final peace negotiations possible. Their warfare wasn't motivated by hatred or desire for conquest. It was motivated by a need to prove themselves worthy of existence through combat achievement. The holographic display shifted to show diplomatic communications from the war's final months. Messages between human leaders and galactic representatives revealed a surprising development in humanity's strategic thinking. Human leadership began expressing concerns that their military success was actually counterproductive to their long-term objectives, the director explained. If they continued winning, they would eventually face the problem of ruling over populations that they had no interest in governing. They were warriors, not administrators or politicians. THYSS looked confused. So they were winning a war they didn't actually want to win? More accurately, they were achieving victory in a way that would deny them what they really wanted, worthy opponents to fight against, Director Ashmiran replied. Human military philosophy was based on the concept that warfare was only meaningful when conducted between equals. If they conquered the galaxy, they would be left with nothing but subjects to rule over instead of enemies to fight. The display showed the final major engagement of the Pacification War, a massive battle involving nearly 1 million ships from both sides. The human fleet was significantly smaller, but their tactics had evolved to a level of sophistication that made numerical superiority irrelevant. The Battle of the Shattered Worlds was intended to be the decisive engagement that would determine the war's outcome, Director Ashmiran narrated as the holographic recreation played out. The Galactic Coalition had assembled the largest military force in recorded history, drawn from every major species and many minor ones. Their strategy was simple: overwhelm human forces through sheer numbers and end the conflict through decisive victory. The battle simulation showed formations of unprecedented scale, with galactic forces arranged in carefully calculated patterns designed to maximize firepower while minimizing the effectiveness of human ramming tactics and close-quarters combat preferences. It should have been the textbook example of how superior numbers and conventional strategy would triumph over unconventional but ultimately limited tactics. Instead, the simulation showed something that defied every principle of military science that the cadets had learned. The human fleet didn't engage the galactic forces directly. Instead, they began broadcasting on all frequencies, transmitting what appeared to be personal messages from individual human warriors to their galactic counterparts. These weren't demands for surrender or propaganda statements, they were invitations. The humans were challenging specific enemy commanders to single combat, Velnox explained as the simulation continued. Ship captains identifying themselves by name and requesting individual duels with worthy opponents. Squadron leaders proposing tactical competitions to see which formation could achieve the most elegant victories. They turned the largest battle in galactic history into a series of personal challenges, Zara-Th observed, her crystals shifting to display amazement. Instead of fighting a war, they were trying to start thousands of smaller wars. And it worked, Director Ashmiran confirmed. Galactic commanders found themselves responding to the challenges. Military leaders who should have been coordinating massive formation attacks instead began engaging in individual competitions with human opponents who treated each encounter as a test of skill and courage rather than a matter of survival. The simulation showed the massive battle gradually dissolving into countless smaller engagements, each one conducted according to informal rules of combat that emerged spontaneously between the participants. Human ships would approach enemy formations and request specific types of combat challenges. Galactic commanders, despite their better judgment, found themselves accepting these challenges. The psychological effect was devastating, the director continued. Galactic forces discovered that fighting humans one-on-one was actually enjoyable. Human opponents were skilled, creative, and seemed genuinely appreciative of clever tactics or impressive displays of courage. They began to understand what human prisoners had meant when they described warfare as spiritually fulfilling. The battle's outcome was unlike anything in military history. Both sides suffered enormous casualties, but, instead of leading to surrender or retreat, the engagement ended with informal truces as individual commanders arranged to continue their personal duels at later dates. Enemy officers began exchanging communications about tactical innovations and expressing mutual respect for combat achievements. The Galactic Coalition leadership realized they had lost control of their own military forces, Director Ashmiran explained. Their commanders were no longer fighting to achieve strategic objectives, they were fighting because they had learned to enjoy combat the way humans did. The war was transforming galactic civilization into something resembling human warrior culture. THYSSR's scales had shifted to a pale color that indicated deep thoughtfulness. So humans were winning by converting their enemies into versions of themselves. Precisely. And that's when both sides realized the war had to end, not because either faction was defeated, but because continuing would fundamentally change what it meant to be part of galactic civilization. The display showed the final peace negotiations, which were unlike any diplomatic process in galactic history. Representatives from both sides met not in formal council chambers, but on the battlefield itself, with active combat continuing in the background as diplomats worked out the terms of humanity's voluntary exile. The agreement was simple, Director Ashmiran concluded. Humans would withdraw from galactic space and establish their own isolated civilization in exchange for the galaxy's promise to leave them alone. In return, galactic civilization would be allowed to return to its peaceful development without the constant threat of being transformed into a warrior culture. But, why was this information classified? Zara-Th asked. Why hide the fact that humans chose exile voluntarily rather than being forced out as punishment? Commandant Zuritha's crystalline form pulsed with deep red hues. Because knowledge of human combat effectiveness is considered a mimetic hazard. Even learning about their military philosophy has been shown to have psychological effects on other species. Some individuals become obsessed with testing themselves against human standards of warfare. Others develop what psychologists call warrior envy, a dissatisfaction with peaceful existence and a desire for the kind of meaningful conflict that humans apparently experience. The ban on discussing human military capabilities exists to protect galactic civilization from itself, Director Ashmiran added. There have been incidents over the centuries where individuals or groups who learned about human warfare attempted to recreate it. The results were always catastrophic. The chamber fell silent as the cadets absorbed the full implications of what they had learned. The species they had been taught to think of as dangerous exiles were actually voluntary hermits who had removed themselves from galactic society to preserve it from transformation into something unrecognizable. But Zara-Th found herself wondering what had happened to humanity during the centuries since their exile.
Had they continued developing their military culture in isolation? Had they grown even more dangerous, or had they perhaps evolved beyond their warrior nature?
And, most disturbing of all, she realized she was genuinely curious about what it would be like to test herself against the standards of combat that had made an entire galaxy afraid. The weeks following their revelation about human history passed in a blur of conflicted emotions for the three cadets. They had been sworn to secrecy about everything they had learned, bound by classification protocols that carried severe penalties for violation. Yet the knowledge burned within them like a hidden flame, changing how they viewed every aspect of their military education. Zara-Th found herself analyzing combat simulations differently, wondering how humans would have approached each tactical scenario. During weapons training, she caught herself thinking about the human concept of acceptable losses and how it might change the mathematics of battlefield decision-making. Her performance in strategic planning exercises improved dramatically as she began incorporating insights derived from human military philosophy, though she carefully avoided revealing the source of her new tactical innovations. Kexhan became obsessed with historical analysis, spending his free time in the Academy's libraries researching the periods immediately before and after the Pacification War. He claimed to be working on an advanced project about galactic political development, but Zara-Th knew he was actually trying to find additional references to human involvement in major historical events. The Thorian's naturally pessimistic outlook had taken on a new dimension. He now viewed galactic civilization as fundamentally incomplete, lacking the depth of purpose that warfare apparently provided. THYSSERA struggled most with the psychological impact of their discovery. The Nexmari were naturally empathetic beings, capable of sensing emotional resonance from other species, and she reported experiencing strange dreams where she could feel echoes of human combat psychology. She described these episodes as simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, giving her glimpses of what it might feel like to find spiritual fulfillment through warfare. Their secret knowledge created an invisible barrier between them and their fellow cadets. Conversations about military history felt superficial when they knew crucial information was being omitted. Training exercises seemed like children's games compared to the level of commitment that humans had apparently brought to actual combat. They began to feel like they were part of an elaborate deception designed to keep galactic civilization ignorant of its own limitations. The situation became unbearable when their advanced tactics instructor, a decorated Brultai veteran named Tormak, began a series of lectures about theoretical combat scenarios involving unknown enemy capabilities. The course was designed to prepare cadets for situations where they might face opponents whose military doctrine and technological capabilities were completely unfamiliar. The greatest danger in warfare, Tormak explained to his assembled students, comes from enemies who don't follow the rules of engagement that you expect. An opponent who values different objectives, who calculates acceptable losses using different criteria, who approaches tactical problems from fundamentally alien perspectives. Zara-Th felt her crystals cycling through agitated colors as she listened to the lecture. The instructor was describing exactly the kind of opponent that humans had apparently been, but he was presenting it as a hypothetical threat rather than historical reality. The disconnect between what she knew and what was being taught became almost physically painful. Can anyone give me an example of how such an opponent might behave differently from conventional military doctrine? Tormak asked, his tusked features displaying the kind of pedagogical enthusiasm that made him popular among the cadets. Several students offered responses about technological surprises or unconventional weapons systems, but Zara-Th found herself thinking about human tactics, ramming attacks, suicide missions, civilian soldiers, the conversion of entire civilizations into military infrastructure. She wanted desperately to contribute to the discussion, but revealing her knowledge would violate every classification protocol she had agreed to follow. Kexhan raised one of his four arms. What about an enemy that doesn't prioritize survival above mission accomplishment? Someone who would accept casualties that we would consider suicidal in order to achieve tactical objectives? The instructor's expression became thoughtful. That's an interesting theoretical scenario, cadet. How do you think conventional forces would adapt to facing such an opponent? They wouldn't, Kexhan replied with characteristic Thorian bluntness. They'd either have to become like their enemy or lose. You can't defeat someone who's willing to pay any price for victory unless you're willing to pay the same price. Tormak nodded approvingly. Excellent analysis. This is exactly the kind of thinking that separates good military strategists from great ones. The ability to recognize when conventional doctrine becomes inadequate and adapt accordingly.
But Zarath could see something else in the instructor's expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even concern, that suggested Kexhan's hypothetical scenario wasn't as theoretical as it appeared. She began to suspect that their revelation about human military capabilities wasn't as unique as they had assumed. How many other people knew the truth? How many instructors were teaching around the edges of classified information, preparing students for threats they couldn't directly acknowledge? That evening, the three friends met in their usual study location, a quiet alcove in the Academy's main library that offered privacy for sensitive discussions. Zarath had brought her portable data processor, loaded with the information they had copied from the hidden archives. "I've been analyzing the tactical reports more carefully," she said, keeping her voice low despite the security measures they had taken. "There are patterns in human military development that don't match anything in our current strategic doctrine." She activated a holographic display showing a timeline of human combat innovations during the Pacification War. "Look at how quickly they adapted to each new threat. Every time galactic forces developed a counter to human tactics, humans would implement a completely different approach within weeks or sometimes days." THYSSRA studied the information, her photographic memory allowing her to process the complex data streams rapidly. "It's not just adaptation," she observed. "They seem to have anticipated each escalation and prepared multiple response strategies in advance. As if they were deliberately forcing the conflict to become more intense." "Because they were," Kexhan said grimly. "Everything we learned suggests that humans weren't trying to win the war in a conventional sense. They were using the conflict to transform themselves into the most effective fighting force possible. Each battle was a test that helped them become better warriors." Zarath felt her crystal shifting to deep blue as she contemplated the implications. "Which means they probably continued that development during the centuries since the war ended. If they were that effective 300 years ago, what are they capable of now?" The question hung in the air between them, representing both fascinating speculation and dangerous territory. Their classification protocols explicitly forbade them from seeking additional information about current human capabilities, but the prohibition only made the mystery more compelling. "There might be a way to find out," THYSSRA said hesitantly. "I've been researching communication protocols used during the peace negotiations. The exile agreement included provisions for limited diplomatic contact in case of emergencies that might affect both civilizations." "What kind of emergencies?" Zarath asked. "Existential threats. Galaxy-wide disasters. Situations where both human and galactic survival might depend on cooperation." THYSSRA's scale shifted to display nervousness. "The communication protocols are still active. There's a hyperspace relay system that maintains a connection to human space." Kexhan's granite features somehow managed to convey alarm. "Please tell me you're not suggesting what I think you're suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything," THYSSRA replied quickly. "I'm just providing information about theoretical possibilities." Zarath felt her analytical mind racing through the implications. The temptation to make contact with actual humans, to learn firsthand about their current military capabilities and cultural development, was almost overwhelming. But she also understood the enormous risks involved. Unauthorized communication with humanity would be considered an act of treason by galactic authorities, potentially triggering diplomatic incidents that could destabilize the entire peace agreement. "Even if we could make contact," she said slowly, "what would we say? Hello, we're alien military students who want to learn about your combat techniques because we think our civilization is incomplete without warfare?" Actually, a new voice said from behind them, that would probably be a very effective opening message. The three cadets spun around to find senior instructor Velnox approaching their study alcove, his gaseous form shimmering with what they had learned to recognize as amusement. Zarath felt her crystals flaring with panic as she realized their conversation had been overheard by someone with the authority to have them expelled or prosecuted. "Instructor," she began, trying to formulate some kind of explanation that wouldn't make their situation worse. "Relax, cadet," Velnox said, settling his containment suit into a nearby chair. "I'm not here to report you for discussing classified information. I'm here because your interest in human military philosophy has been noted by certain individuals who believe it might be useful." "Useful for what?" Kexhan asked suspiciously. Velnox's form shifted through several configurations before he answered. "Are you familiar with the concept of mimetic contamination in military thinking?" The idea that exposure to certain tactical philosophies can fundamentally alter how an individual approaches combat situations? We've heard of it, THYSSRA said carefully.
Good. Then, you understand that your unauthorized research has already changed how you think about warfare, strategy, and acceptable risk calculations. You can't unknow what you've learned about human military capabilities, and that knowledge will continue to influence your development as military officers. Zara Th felt a chill run through her crystalline structure.
Are you saying we've been psychologically contaminated?
I'm saying you've been exposed to a different way of thinking about military problems, Velnox corrected.
Whether that's contamination or enhancement depends on how the knowledge is used. The instructor leaned forward, his gaseous form becoming more concentrated.
There are some people in positions of authority who believe that galactic military doctrine has become too focused on minimizing risk and avoiding confrontation. They think our emphasis on peaceful solutions and diplomatic resolutions has made us vulnerable to threats that can't be negotiated with.
What kind of threats? Kexhan asked.
The kind that might require the same level of commitment and tactical innovation that humans demonstrated during the Pacification War, Velnox replied. There have been monitoring expeditions to the galactic periphery that have detected signs of potential hostile activity. Nothing confirmed yet, but enough to make some people worry about our current level of military preparedness.
THYSSRA's scale shifted to pale colors indicating fear. You're talking about external threats. Things from outside the galaxy.
I'm talking about the possibility that galactic civilization might someday need to defend itself against enemies who don't share our values about minimizing casualties and seeking peaceful resolutions, Velnox said.
And if that day comes, we might need military leaders who understand how to fight the way humans fought. The implications of what the instructor was suggesting began to sink in.
Zara Th realized that their unauthorized research hadn't been discovered by accident. They had been allowed to find the hidden archives, allowed to learn about human military history, possibly even encouraged to develop an interest in human combat philosophy. You want us to make contact with humanity, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I want you to understand that certain individuals believe such contact might be necessary for galactic security, Velnox replied carefully.
Of course, any such contact would have to be completely unofficial and absolutely deniable. If discovered, the individuals involved would be considered rogue agents acting without authorization. But, if we're successful? Kexhan asked.
Then, galactic civilization might gain access to military knowledge that could prove essential for our survival, Velnox said.
And 3 exceptional cadets might discover what it really means to be warriors.
He stood and began to move away from their study area, but paused before leaving entirely. The hyperspace relay to human space is accessible through Communication Hub 7 in the diplomatic sector.
The access codes are Zeta 97 Alpha Tango.
The emergency contact protocol requires a message indicating existential threat assessment and request for consultation.
And if we get caught? THYSSRA called after him.
Then, you'll be prosecuted as traitors who violated the most important treaty in galactic history, Velnox replied.
Choose carefully.
Left alone with this impossible decision, the 3 cadets stared at each other in stunned silence. They were being offered the opportunity to make contact with the species that had nearly conquered the galaxy, to learn military secrets that could transform their understanding of warfare. But, the price of failure would be the destruction of their careers, their freedom, and, possibly their lives. Worse yet, success might mean becoming part of a conspiracy that could fundamentally alter the nature of galactic civilization, potentially triggering the very conflicts that the Exile Treaty had been designed to prevent. Zara Th felt her crystals cycling through every color in her species' emotional spectrum as she struggled with the decision.
Her analytical mind understood the risks and the potential consequences.
But, another part of her, a part that had been awakened by learning about human military philosophy, was already composing the message they would send. Because deep down, she realized she needed to know what it felt like to be a real warrior. The decision to make contact took 3 days of agonized debate. They met in secret locations throughout the academy, weighing the potential consequences against their burning need to understand what lay beyond the boundaries of conventional galactic military thinking.
Ultimately, it was THYSSRA who provided the deciding argument.
We're already contaminated, she said during their final discussion. We can't unknow what we've learned about human warfare, and that knowledge is going to influence everything we do for the rest of our careers. We can either try to suppress it and become mediocre officers, or we can pursue it and, maybe become something more. Zara Th felt the truth of that statement resonating through her crystalline structure. The human combat philosophy had indeed changed how she approached tactical problems, making conventional military doctrine feel incomplete and unsatisfying. She found herself craving challenges that would test her abilities in ways that Academy simulations never could.
Kexan provided the practical framework for their decision.
If we're caught, we're finished anyway.
If we succeed, we might learn something that makes the risk worthwhile. And if we do nothing, we'll spend our entire careers wondering what we might have discovered.
The journey to Communication Hub 7 required careful planning. The diplomatic sector was heavily monitored, and unauthorized access to interstellar communication systems was one of the most serious violations possible at the Academy.
But THYSSRA's natural talent for infiltration, combined with Kexan's knowledge of the Academy's security systems and Zara Th's ability to interface directly with computer networks, gave them the skills they needed.
They made their approach during the early hours of the night shift, when skeleton crews maintained essential systems while most personnel rested. THYSSRA's serpentine form allowed her to navigate through maintenance corridors that were too small for most species, while Kexan's massive strength enabled him to manipulate heavy security barriers. Zara Th served as their interface with the Academy's computer systems, using her crystalline physiology to access and modify security protocols. Communication Hub 7 was a vast chamber filled with hyperspace relay equipment capable of maintaining real-time connections across galactic distances. The technology was sophisticated beyond anything the cadets had worked with before, but the basic principles were familiar from their communications training. The human relay is isolated from the main network, Zara Th observed as she interfaced with the system's primary console.
It looks like it hasn't been used in over 50 years.
Are you sure it still works?
Kexan asked, standing guard near the chamber's entrance.
Only one way to find out, Zara Th replied, her crystals flaring as she activated the emergency contact protocol that Instructor Velnox had provided. The relay system hummed to life, its harmonics creating vibrations that resonated through the chamber's structure. Lights that had remained dark for decades began to glow as the connection to human space was established. For several moments, nothing happened except the steady pulse of the active communication link.
Then, the system received a response.
The voice that emerged from the speakers was unmistakably human, though it carried undertones that suggested extensive cybernetic enhancement.
It spoke in perfectly clear Galactic standard, though with an accent that none of the cadets had ever heard before. This is Marshal Sarah Chen, 3rd Human Defense Fleet, responding to emergency contact from Galactic Military Academy.
Please state the nature of the existential threat requiring consultation. The three cadets stared at each other in shock. They had expected to reach some kind of automated system or perhaps a low-level diplomatic functionary. Instead, they appeared to be speaking directly with a high-ranking military officer.
Zara Th stepped forward and activated the communication interface.
Marshal Chen, this is Cadet Zara Th of the Veltar. We're requesting consultation regarding potential external threats that might require unconventional military responses. There was a pause before the human voice responded, and, when it did, there was something that might have been amusement in its tone.
Cadet Zara Th, you do realize that unauthorized use of this communication channel is considered an act of treason by your government?
Yes, Marshal.
We understand the risks. Good. That suggests you might actually be worth talking to. The voice became more serious. External threats requiring unconventional responses. Are we talking about something specific, or is this a theoretical consultation? THYSSRA leaned toward the communication array.
Marshal, we've discovered historical records about the pacification war and human military capabilities. We believe our current military doctrine might be inadequate for facing certain types of enemies.
Ah, the human voice said, and this time there was definitely amusement there.
You've learned about the old days and decided that your civilization needs to become more like ours.
Tell me, cadets, what makes you think that humanity's approach to warfare would be beneficial for galactic civilization?
Kexan spoke up, his voice carrying typical Thorian directness.
Because you won. You fought the entire galaxy and won until you chose to stop fighting.
We want to understand how that's possible. We won because we were willing to become monsters, Marshal Chen replied, her tone suddenly cold. We transformed ourselves into living weapons that prioritize destruction above survival, victory above sanity, combat effectiveness above every other aspect of existence.
Is that really what you want for your people?
The bluntness of the response caught all three cadets off guard. They had expected humans to be proud of their military achievements, perhaps even eager to share their combat knowledge. Instead, Marshal Chen seemed to be warning them against pursuing the very information they sought. "Marshal," Zarath said carefully, "we've studied the records of your conflicts with galactic forces. Your military innovations were remarkable, your tactical flexibility unprecedented. Surely there are lessons that could benefit other species without requiring the complete transformation you're describing." "You think you can learn to fight like humans without becoming like humans," the Marshal said. "Every species that's tried that approach has either failed completely or succeeded too well. There's no middle ground with our methods, cadets. Either you commit entirely to the warrior path, or you remain what you are now."
"And what are we now?" THYSSERA asked.
"Civilized," came the immediate response. "You're rational beings who value survival, who calculate acceptable losses, who fight wars to achieve political objectives while minimizing casualties. You're everything we gave up becoming when we chose the warrior's path." Zarath felt her crystals cycling through confused colors. The humans' responses seemed designed to discourage further contact rather than provide the military consultation they had expected. "Marshal, if human military methods are so destructive to those who use them, why did you develop them in the first place?" "Because we had no choice," Marshal Chen replied, and, for the first time her voice carried undertones of something that might have been sadness. "When you're facing extinction, you either become whatever you need to become to survive, or you cease to exist.
We chose survival, but the price was becoming something that the galaxy couldn't coexist with."
"But you've maintained your civilization for 3 centuries since the exile, Kex,"